I want to thank the Director General, and all the trustees. This is beginning to sound really like an army. But I want to thank you all for inviting me to speak today. And Jitish, before we start our conversation about the work, I just wanted to acknowledge that a conversation like this initiated around a letter sent by a letter which was undelivered, but sent by Gandhi to Hitler, and a letter which tries to open a dialogue. I have no idea how successful the dialogue would have been. I'm actually pretty sure it would have gone nowhere. But the fact that the gesture of dialogue, the gesture of conversation is made in this work, irrespective of the contents which we will talk about, it seems to me that that desire for dialogue is extraordinarily important in our time as then. Because the concept of the argumentative Indian, my colleague Amartya Sen bravely floated several years ago in an attempt to think about public reason, a concept which he is very affiliated with. That notion of argumentation, I think, as I see it, is largely lost in many countries, but I find it in public discourse in India really very scarce. It seems to me that there is a continual kind of tit-for-tat democratic dialogue. It's a tit-for-tat democracy, very much determined by the polarizations of political positions, and the idea that an argument demands not only your putting your position, but you're listening to the other side, and then somehow occupying the place of the other to whom you then respond. That, I think, is lost. So I think the time in India at the moment with arguments, as I see them certainly in the media, is where, IQs are measured by decibel levels. And I think that is actually very unfortunate, and this work reminds us that there is a place not so much for the argumentative Indian, but for the interlocutory Indian. Interlocution being a way of talking which really depends on the ethical sense of wanting to inhabit the place from which your dialoguist or the person who opposes you, where he or she stands, and then to reflect on your own position. And of course this requires space and time and waiting to hear, and also the ethics of listening. So I think that we are here with this work in a very important moment to think about democratic dialogue and public life. And so I want to thank the museum, I want to thank the Nicholson Gallery, I want to thank the audience, I want to thank Bombay for making it possible to reflect on this very important issue. So much for introduction, but I do want to start not with the content of the work, because it's my belief that when you look at works of art, you have to follow their language and form, and then allow them to lead you into the content. But I want to ask you, Jitish, that you're very interested in your works in the form of language. Language is a tactile form, aesthetic form, the ways letters look, the notion of the font, the notion of the way in which in reading your eye, at least reading English and several other languages, your eye moves from left to right or right to left. The time between, the gaps between sentences, the construction of a page. You're very interested in the nature of language as a form of design. And so I was wondering how and what language as a form does for your work.
Thank you, Homi. Let me also begin with a round of thank yous, and thanking Homi first of all for taking the time to have this dialogue. And since 2010, since the moment of public notice 3, I've relished each of the conversations we've had.
Thank you. Very generous.
Thank you to Mr. Sabyasachi, to Kamini, the team at CSMBS, JNF, and HMOT. I'm hurrying through my thank yous to get to what Homi just asked me, and trying to stay in that space of reflection. As you so correctly pointed out, Homi, for me, in fact, the gateway to really the context is content, not just as the material that the artwork finds itself pivoting around, which could be a speech or a letter in this instance, but essentially the form and structure that same object would transform into. In the case of covering letter, am I audible? Yeah. Okay. In the case of covering letter, really, I think the space of the artwork is almost an auditorium of darkness, within which the articulation of the words is really through the form of light and shadow, where essentially through a conical outflow of photons that find some kind of a resting space on a descending film of molecules of water, is really the space where the letter actually emerges in that conversation between the outflow of light and the descending film of mist, in the space of which the emergent form is the letter, and the light is the letter in this instance, which then continues its journey onto the floor, creating in fact a space where, as the letter descends within the film of ascending mist, it also in its inverse begins its journey outwards in the direction of viewer, who's then walking towards the letter. And in some ways, this forms for me a structure possibly within which the body could inhabit the letter itself, where, and in a way it's somewhat satisfying for us artists that the experience we have in the studios or when we make a piece of work, there's that much that you think about it and then your brain shuts down and then you're actually thinking through your body. And now that science tells us that, that the body as such is a computing device, that intelligence or insight is actually in every cell of the body through a cascade of chemical, magnetic responses, electromagnetic responses that the body computes through in some ways. And in some ways for me that the experience of the bodily to find a space within the letter is quite central to the experience of the piece.
You know, the work, as you were speaking, reminds me also of Mary Kelly's work, where on flint, you know, on flint, the flint that you get from the washing machine, you know, that she, on the lint of the washing machine, yes, she projected narratives actually to do with the Bosnian War, and I think it was rather beautiful, similar kind of effect. And when you raise the question of the body in that context, the body of language, the body in language, of course, we are in the realm of a certain kind of phenomenological thought, where it is not the subject that actually simply expresses language, but language itself that forms the subject. And that, of course, also has a linkage with our use of certain kinds of digital and computing machines. You know, what is the relationship in that sense between smart and artificial intelligence and intelligence? So I think this breaks down, as I can see this work itself, as you walk into the letter, the immersive experience, it breaks down that binary notion, that distance between the I as the site of knowledge and the object, that whole epistemological relationship, as you were speaking, is broken down by this phenomenological spatial, temporal insertion of the body into language. Now, it's an interesting issue as to how that kind of idea forms the kernel of an installation, because installations are just not parked somewhere. All installations are interventions, in my view. You know, Vivant's thing at the Victoria Memorial, you know, the other public notice. So installations are interventions. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about this intervention in this museum, in this city. Installations are site specific, although the site might change. And at the same time, the way in which the concept of the public in public note, in the concept of the idea of public notice, the notion of the public notice becomes a very specific kind of body. I was interested in that issue, but we mustn't forget that in this work there is the body being processed through the letter, but there is also the person who writes the letter and the recipient. So it's our body, and then there is Hitler, and then there is Gandhi, and then there is a particular kind of language, dear friend, dear friend, dear friend. And I was interested to hear from you what kind of intervention you thought you were making with this installation here and now.
It's so interesting, Homi, that you put forth this relationship between the body of the viewer, which is all of us, and the two other bodies that form a kind of triangular relationship within the work, the other two bodies, of course, being absent except for their names appearing within the space of the letter. To me, at one fundamental level, this museum and the diverse audiences this museum receives is a reward of sorts for the kind of outreach that I would like within the space of an art object, to function completely within the territory of being an art object, to reach the widest possible audience, to hopefully open up through the letter what one might think of as a space of self-reflection. A space in which the self is in fact inhabiting the absent bodies of the author of the letter, that one often doesn't realize when one sees the letter emerge. The letter is in fact in a mode of befriending. As you walk in, it says, dear friend, friends have been urging me to write to you for the sake of humanity, and makes a 7-line plea to the reader. And it's only when the letter leaves that you realize that you are actually in the space between two figures who one could describe in various ways, but one shorthand way of describing them would be as a principal proponent of peace at a particular historic moment, reaching out to possibly the most brutal perpetrator of violence at that same historical moment. And in some ways, the self of the viewer then inhabits these two figures as metonyms of possibly the extent to which within ourselves we could possibly find extremes of ourselves that could enact extremes of what we think we might or might not be able to enact.
I have had many thoughts about my own double nature, but I never thought I was Gandhi and Hitler together. But this is a good way of trying to, you know, to think about that. One issue that I think that we need to talk about in terms of the work is that the darkness and light and the way in which language works makes of this installation something I hadn't thought about as an intervention. It's also a cinematic intervention. The notion of the screen and the letter come very closely. It's a very cinematic work. It's dramatic in a cinematic way, and I think that's something that we haven't talked about. Although now that we raise the question of a more phenomenological notion of the reception and identification with the work, I think cinema or quasi-cinema or installation as cinema becomes very important. The next issue I wanted to raise, when you said, you know, there are figures here, but there are also two letters. There is the letter of 1939 that you've just, you know, you work with, and then And then there is the letter of 1940, December 40. Now, of course, what's happened between 39 and December 40 is the invasion of Poland, Czechoslovakia. You know, Hitler by no means can be seen to be a friend to humanity. And at that point, Gandhi writes to him in a very different way. And I didn't know how many people knew those letters, so I thought I should just give you a sense. I'm sure many of you do, but just to remind you, it's a long letter, but I've just chosen a small excerpt from it. He says, I hope you will have the time and desire to know how a good portion of humanity are living under the influence of that doctrine of universal friendship. View your action. We have no doubt about your bravery or devotion to your fatherland, nor do we believe that you are the monster described by your opponents. But your own writings and pronouncements, and those of your friends and admirers, leave no room for doubt that many of your acts are monstrous and unbecoming of human dignity, especially in the estimation of men like me, who believe in universal friendliness. And I think it's a fine Gandhian distinction between the hope that you always give to the human, that the human can change, so that you are not a monster, but what your acts are monstrous. And I think that's a very fine and small sort of Gandhian move there. Such is your humiliation of Czechoslovakia, the rape of Poland, and the swallowing of Denmark. I'm aware that your view of life regards such spoliation as virtuous acts, but we have been taught from childhood to regard them as acts degrading humanity. Hence, we cannot possibly wish success to your arms. Now, this is, I think, a very interesting moment, and I've skipped a lot of it. You are leaving no legacy to your people of which they would feel proud. They cannot take pride in a recital of cruel deed, however skillfully planned. I therefore appeal to you in the name of humanity to stop the war. And of course, the truth of it is that the Germans have never got over that humiliation, whether they're working it out in Kiefer, whether they're working out in Boyce. I mean, again and again in films, Fassbinder, it's part of the whole cult of the aesthetic and the political in Germany, and I think it still in many ways exists. Maybe what Angela Merkel recently did with the migrants to some extent has turned that vision. So there's a covering letter, but a year later there's an uncovering letter. And I wondered why you had chosen the first. And that's my first question to you. But then, just thinking aloud with you, I was wondering whether, from the aesthetic point of view, your interest in this mist, in the screen which is like paper, which has the same ephemerality and fragility of paper, whether you're writing on both sides, the recto and verso of a piece of paper, if you think of it that tropically, would it be possible to make a work? Would it be technologically possible, as well as aesthetically and ideologically, to make a work which should have had both those letters interleaved? Because it seems to me, from my perspective, that Gandhi wrote those two letters, and they are like the recto and verso of a piece of paper. And I feel that if I didn't know the second letter, I would have missed much of this discourse, this interlocution, as I called it.
I think, Homi, that's so beautifully said, because in some ways the uncovering of the letter in the second letter was for me quite fundamental to in fact verify, and only partly verify. I don't think I've actually completely understood the first letter in a way that it's deeply ambivalent. I mean, the word that appears twice, and Homi, maybe you can speak about that a little later, is really the word friend. And the letter almost begins and ends with the word friend, almost like parentheses, by Gandhi addressing Hitler, as Gandhi defines in his second letter, which he prefaces with the line, I own no foe. In my world of universal friendship, I own no foe. There's no space for an enemy. And he, in fact, I think, justifies the gesture in the earlier letter. But also what comes through for me some ways, Homi, in the second letter, is this feeling that one gets on reading the first letter, that in its absolute economy of the number of things it sets out to say, it is possibly also a letter that goes beyond the intended recipient, and it goes beyond its intended date, as if it's an open letter to a wider set of readers. And this feeling comes through to me from the second letter, where after he goes on to in some ways justify to Hitler in first person the form of address of calling him a friend, and also outlines his brutality, which of course Hitler was to commit his greatest brutality thereon from the space of the first to the second letter. But he also, in a sense, extends thereon to speak about the British, and starts describing in the second letter really how a fifth of humanity is held to ransom by an illegal invading power, and also makes remarks such as, in the battlefield we hope not to defeat our enemy but to convert them. And I think also continues to lay out a manual of instructions for whatever it may be worth, as Gandhi says in his first letter, in the second one. But when he signs off, he actually also says that this letter might as well be for Signor Mussolini, with the appropriate changes made, is the last line. So in fact, it also seems like this letter could address his collaborator in that moment of brutality. So I think in some ways, your usage of the term uncovering letter really seems to be so appropriate, that that in some ways the ambivalence that's put out in the first letter is answered in the second. But to me, in some ways, within the space of the covering letter, it is the restraint of the first letter that made it a space of not knowing, and a contemplation that comes from entirely not knowing.
But Jitish, I think they make together, in my view, a more powerful meeting, because I think what they do is also show the limits of a certain Gandhian ideology. That is not to say, all forms of belief have their limits. And I think it does show that. And it seems to me that when the first letter, and I've read it several times, I thought, this is 3 months before. This is July, August, September, 2 months before the invasion of Pearl.
5 weeks apart.
5 weeks apart, There is no ambiguity as to what is happening. There's already appalling laws being enacted. Kristallnacht has already happened, where all the kind of Jewish, the synagogues, everything was crashed and trashed. So it seems to me that I think an interleaving with respect. Last time I said with respect to somebody, he said, that's a very English thing. I know you want to say how you disagree with me, and maybe there is a kind of sense there. But it does seem to me that the two letters have a tension between them. They show also the limits of the first letter. They also show that in the concision of the first letter there are a lot of problems. Now, one of the problems is that the analogy between anti-colonial struggle or empire and fascism is one thing. But from what I can tell, and maybe I've missed it, of course there is the mention of Poland and Czechoslovakia. There's actually no mention of the Jews. There is no mention of Jews. Now, 40, correct me if I'm wrong, there are better historians here than I am, but 40 is a little too early for people's knowledge of the genocidal extermination. I think it's a little too early from what I can remember historically. People did, but there was no question that what had happened was a particular group of people had been targeted with all the most venomous and venal sins. There were projections, there was stereotypy. And somebody like Gandhi, who was so sensitive, having supported the caste system generally, but so sensitive to what we would call the untouchables or the Dalits, who realize what a form of minoritization can be. Minorities are not minorities because they say we're minorities. They are minoritized. It's an agential act of the state. So it seems strange to me that that's missing from this letter. But having said that, let me, you talked about the ambivalences in the letters. I think there's more conflict than ambivalence. But let me talk about an ambivalence I have to the work itself, an ambivalence. And I think this goes back to a conversation we'd had earlier on, which is that when I first thought about the work, I liked the ingenuity of presentation of the letter. I thought that worked very well. But I felt uneasy about a work based on a memory, a recollection of Hitler and what he'd done, that actually had this mist in a space of darkness. Now, let me be a vulgar materialist historian for a moment, and I know it's not the whole story, but there is a way in which, when you think of the way in which the Jews were led into dark spaces, being told that they were actually going to be showered and bathed, and then if you look at any illustration, you have that same kind of mist that then asphyxiated and killed them en masse. The very act of genocide of a very, or at that time, rather sophisticated technological kind. So it does, I feel I need to ask you what you make of that. And I'm saying this knowing that when I made the connection, you had not thought about it. So I don't think you're deliberately trying to, displace that or make an ironic reference. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so to speak. But it's my response that I did feel that it was too close for comfort, without in some way being distanced from that, or that moment being contextualized.
You know, in some ways, Homi, at the moment when we had that conversation, I still continue to hold the feeling that for a letter that sets out with an economy of words to the word count that there is in the letter, my own words about that work be much little in comparison to the words in the letter itself. And that's a feeling that I've held for a while. This is probably the first time I'm speaking about the work to any degree of elaboration. Well, the artwork, in fact, as an artwork, came to me a bit like other pieces of mine come to me, in a somewhat nebulous space of not entirely knowing all the coordinates of the work. And often that continues for a very, very long period of time. It often continues with this feeling that what one had thought, one had known, is not what it was meant to be. And this is a continuous process in some ways. To me, a covering letter found a form in formlessness, in a form of traversability. That's really the image with which I set out to make a covering letter. But in retrospect, deep in that intuition is several themes, several metaphors, several ideas, and yet you don't know them fully when you're making them. Even today, I'm standing at the back, it continues to say other things which I hadn't thought about. And it was beautiful to hear you speak in a way transforming through, in the middle of a sentence, the mist into gas, in the beautiful way in which you articulated it when we were in the studio together. And subsequently, and also during its presentation at Kiev, these references have been made subsequently by a few other colleagues. And in some ways, Homi, there is a discomfort in almost all of the public notice pieces. Maybe perhaps to a lesser degree than this one. But for instance, with Public Notice 3, while 70,000 light bulbs illuminate all the risers of the Art Institute of Chicago, they are essentially signals from the coding system that the US administration had marked as threat codes for an entire decade. as a terror coding system that refracts Vivekananda's words. But equally there's a physical discomfort, because not past the 6th or 7th step could one walk without essentially moving instinctively sideways to the edge of the stairway. And in some ways this continues with even earlier works, such as the first public notice, where you are continuously confronted with a progressive distortion of even your self-image in the charred letter, or the continuous overlay of the fossilized form of the alphabet as one reads Gandhi's words in public notice 2. So I think a certain kind of visceral bodily discomfort, in this case of course, as you rightly point out, it's heightened by another kind of even crafty artifice on the part of the Führer, so to speak, that it's a cleansing process, and then it becomes something else, becomes a factory of death. And I think that transformative force intercepted in some ways in this case with the shadow of an alphabet from a letter that actually calls for a restraint for in fact something that was imminently about to happen. I mean, I wouldn't want to assign a premonitory role to that letter, but I just like the fact that the date precedes the moment when the concentration camp, as until then existed as an intense labor camp, brutal labor camp with a high mortality rate, transforming in the same duration into becoming a center for death. And so in some ways...
My question, reflecting on the other works that you talked about, I think the issue here for me, and I don't think, and I'm not raising this because I think this is an issue that can be resolved or should be resolved, but it seemed to me, I'm trying to examine my own discomfort, that in Public Notice 3, where you use the security code on the risers, there is already a kind of reworking of the location. These lights, these security lights, understand them, interpret them as you would. And of course, we must remember that they were signs of homeland security, and we must understand what happens in the name of what happened post 9/11 in the name of the homeland. Third country rendition being just one of the outsourced sites for American homeland security torture and so on. But in the actual placing of the work, there is a kind of deflation of the whole economy of security. And you have to work that out. Now here, I think my discomfort came from the fact that once you knew this fact, it was much more mimetic. It was much less processed. It was much less, it was much less transformed or translated or made into a kind of enigma which you then discover hermeneutically through the work. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
That's my concern with it. Not that, that it needed another working to make it more experiential or phenomenological or bodily rather than the way it is, which seemed to me to be less effective for not being worked more.
In fact, Homi, with me, you're absolutely right. I mean, I haven't physically entered this letter like I would have entered the other letters. There's an act of arrangement of words because those were transcripts. And this essentially is the letter as is, atomized. This is a letter that's continuously dispersing and breaking down. The form of this letter is its perennial atomization, forming at one level a level of mist, and as you rightly read, at another level the form of gas. And I think to me my intervention in that letter is as minimal as its perennial dispersal. In reverse, what that does, purely by default of how light falls on anything that's breaking apart, is that you have a completely diffused floor from which it gains legibility as it as the letter rises. And to me, in some ways, that's all I do. To bring the letter, unlike in previous iterations where it's alphabet by alphabet, as you so beautifully said in that lecture which Homi delivered a resounding lecture at the closing of the Public Notice 3 at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he went back to the word letter by letter, word by word, step by step. And in this case, really, it's the sentence by sentence formation from absolute illegibility, in fact, from the inverse to illegibility to legibility, and then it leaves.
I think that I think works very well. I think my concern is that there's too close a kind of mimetic relationship between mist and gas. That's the issue. It's too recognizable. And in the others, you know, every letter is transformed so that the work is really translated, not transcended. The public notices are not transcended, but genuinely translated. But let's get past this one. I just wanted to raise it. And I want to just return, as we come to the close of our conversation, to this line from Gandhi's second letter, which I think is a fascinating, conflicting, if there's ambivalence, it's I think very profoundly in that letter, even as he's being condemnatory in a very open way. You are leaving no legacy to your people of which they would feel proud. They cannot take pride in a recital of cruel deed, however skillfully planned. And this is, in a way, a public notice. Gandhi is putting on notice not only Hitler, but also universal humanity, who are actually many of them standing by, you know, and he's putting the world on notice. What kind of notice are you serving your public, whoever you imagine them to be, with these public notice works? How are you putting them on notice?
It's a very tough one, Homi.
Leave it.
Yeah, I think maybe leaving it is the right way, because in a way, to me, you know, I've often found it very, very hard to put a very firm response to what, I mean, what does one do when one has, I mean, when I think back to the moment when I saw Covering Letter, there was a minor epiphany of sorts. But what does one do? One goes into silence rather than act on that. You know, one doesn't really know what is the response in which an idea seeds and becomes an action, then becomes an artwork. And I think in you know, the feeling is one of recoil, that one often cannot, and perhaps I might even risk at saying should not, because one has seen the perils of trying to know too much of things that are sometimes unknowable. Maybe leaving it is a space that I feel.
Well, I remember, well, we don't leave you alone. Thanks for your generosity, because Geeta and I keep beating up on you on this very, who is your public? What is the notice? How will we, you remember the right. Published dialogue with Kim Kuno?
Yes, yeah. In fact, that was a 4-day e-conversation centered from Yale University Press, and all of us were in different parts of the world, when Homi in particular wanted firm answers, and you know, it's very, very hard for me to actually be sure. I mean, I didn't want firm answers. I wanted to know simply why and how you had thought about this notion of a public, and what a public notice is. You know, I remember that, you know, the moment of in that conversation, there was also the place of the political.
Yes.
And I remember in some ways in a passing remark saying that one often doesn't know whether, and this also came out of a reference to John Baldessari that James had made earlier in the conversation, that whether post a bomb blast, is it essentially a political act to hold a placard? If the bomb blast was at a cinema hall, would it be a political act to go watch a movie the next morning? You know, that level of uncertainty one feels about where does the political lie, you know, makes me just return to silence.
I would say it depends on the quality of movie you choose.
Yes, or the quality of the placard one makes. You know.
So let me just end, let's just end now. I think that the interest of, at least from my point of view, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, of public notice, is the choice you've made of the text and the actual figural deformations or displacements you make. And I suppose the answer to my question, to some extent, comes from the kind of conversation we've had today. Before we end, Jitish, I would just like to read from another letter written on September 1, 1939 by W.H. Auden. I'm not going to read the whole poem, I'm just going to read a few stanzas. But I think it might just resonate rather well with the issues that Gandhi raises in the name of global humanity, in the name of global humanity. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offense from Luther until now that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz, what huge imago made a psychopathic god. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. From the conservative dark into the ethical life, the dense commuters come repeating their morning vow. I will be true to my life. I will concentrate on my work. And helpless governors wait to resume their compulsory game. Who can release them now? Who can reach the deaf? Who can speak of the dumb? All I as a poet have is a voice to undo the folded line, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yet, dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.